Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the special lecture session on the theme of ethnicity and religion in Central Asia as a part of the Exploring Central Asia talk series organized by the Tillotoma Foundation. I am Kamakshi Wason, Chief Operating Officer and Director of Academic Programs, Tillotoma Foundation. Tillotoma Foundation works globally in the areas of international relations, diplomacy, area studies, gender, environmental, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. The foundation curates quality academic programs in diverse subject areas. I would firstly like to thank Mr. Soham Das, Chairperson and Director, Tillotoma Foundation, for his generous support and encouragement throughout the course of the ongoing Exploring Central Asia talk series. The Eurasian region, particularly Central Asia, has been an important focus area of the foundation. We have a dedicated Central Asia Center at the Tillotoma Foundation. Over the years, the foundation has actively cooperated with and worked with institutions, senior experts, diplomats from Central Asia. The foundation has also organized several high-level track 2 diplomatic conclaves and major international seminars on Central Asia. Today, we are here to discuss the potential of ethnicity and religion in Central Asia. The question of ethnicity and religion are of crucial importance in the context of Central Asia. In recent years, there has been a growing interest in the intersection between religion and ethnicity in Central Asia. Central Asia is a region where the intersection of ethnic and religious identities have played an important role in shaping the collective experience and self-perception of the people and in shaping the geopolitical landscape in the region and around the world. Understanding the intersections between the religion and ethnicity is essential to achieving greater understanding and cooperation between different communities and cultures in Central Asia. There are numerous different theories to explain the relation between ethnicity and religion and how they contribute to stability or instability in a given society. Religion in Central Asia is an important part of identity formation and social cohesion, but in many cases, the very idea of religion has been used to marginalize or exclude certain groups from society. The dynamics of this relationship are complex and change over time. There are many factors that affect this relationship, including historical background, culture, economics, and politics. It is also influenced by the ideology that a particular country or region follows. Central Asia is a region that has seen a significant influx of people from diverse backgrounds over the past few decades due to various factors, including migration and conflict. The diversity of our people and their cultures have an important role to play in the development of this region. But in order for this diversity to be fully harnessed for the good of the people of the region and the world at large, we need to explore new ways of working together. I'm sure our speaker for today will talk in detail about this. I'm sure that we will have an interesting and insightful discussion. I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished speaker for today, an eminent expert on Eurasia, Mr. Paul Goble, former special advisor to the Secretary of State of the United States. He has worked with the State Department in the United States and Central Intelligence Agency. He writes frequently on ethnic and religious issues in the former Soviet space. Thank you, Mr. Goble, for being here today to speak on this pertinent topic. It's so great to see you here. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and analysis. This is a very interesting and nuanced topic to explore today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this special lecture session on ethnicity and religion in Central Asia. I would now like to request Mr. Paul Goble to start with this presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Goble.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to commend your foundation for having this series and to express my gratitude that you've chosen to include me in it. The issues of religion and ethnicity in Central Asia are especially important, and tragically, they are among the most misunderstood of anywhere in Eurasia. When the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991 and 5 countries emerged in Central Asia, they were quickly dismissed by many people as the stands. They weren't even dignified by having their names listed. they became collectively the stands. And many, many people around the world decided that they were first Muslims, second, they were former Soviets, and third, they were Turks. None of those dismissive comments are entirely true. It has now been 30 years since the Soviet Union had disappeared, and more than half of the population in Central Asia was born after that time. And if you include those who only came of age at 21 in 1991 or later, we're talking about nearly 70% of the population of the area. So thinking of this area just as Soviet is a huge mistake. The issue of Islam is quite a bit more complicated. And I'd like first in my talk to address the Islamic problem, if you will, and second, to focus on ethnicity, on the 5 nations that have states now and their relations with ethnic minorities in those states, because I think that's going to be a serious driver that will determine whether these countries can offer the best possible life to all the people who live on their territories, and also the extent to which they can cooperate with each other and cooperate with the broader world. So that's my agenda. And finally, what I want to do is talk a little bit about how the outside world can deal with these 2 factors in Central Asia, trying to overcome, excuse me, some of the mythology and Orientalism, which tragically continues to inform how many people choose to see this enormous community of more than 100 million people who are an important part of the world today. What we now think of as the 5 countries of post-Soviet Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, have a very complicated history as to religion. There were many of the people in this area were followers of other religions prior to the Islamic conquest or the spread of Islam to the area. We need to remember, as we'll come back to talk about the ethnic origins of the peoples. 3 of the nations which form Central Asia today, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, and the Tajiks, Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, and the Turkmens, were nomadic peoples, and they were only incompletely Islamicized. Large numbers of them, right up through into the Soviet period, were followers of animist trends. Speaking of these people as somehow fully absorbed Muslims, fully committed Muslims, has always been a mistake. The second is that the spread of Islam to the masses, as opposed to the intellectual elite, was really completed only in the 19th century. And it was completed, as people have tended to forget, by missionaries from Tatarstan, who represented the modernist Jadid tradition of Islam, rather than the more fundamentalist versions that are out there. The Islam that is practiced in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, the 2 sedentary populations which were most affected by the Tatar missionaries, therefore has a tradition not of being extremist or fundamentalist, as many outsiders say, but rather a tradition of being part of the modernist part of Islam, what is sometimes referred to as Euro-Islam. That may seem very strange for an area so many thousand kilometers from Europe, but in fact, it's critical to understand, because almost the only coverage that we have about Islam in Central Asia focuses on a very, very tiny sliver of that community. Those who have accepted a fundamentalist version, either because of the activities of Iranian representatives or the Taliban from Afghanistan. That's what the Russian press talks about. That's what the American press talks about. Those are kinds of things that people can focus on because they seem to represent an immediate threat to the stability of these countries. Is there a fundamentalist problem in Central Asia? Yes, there is. There are places where the impact of Iran and of Afghanistan on the thinking of Muslims in Central Asia are all too great. Typically, however, it's only a small part of the population of the countries. In Tajikistan, for example, on the one hand, there's significant influence from by Afghanistan in the Pamir, the Gorno-Badakhshan, which constitutes about a third of the territory of Tajikistan, but only about 3% of the population. And at the same time, Tajikistan and the Tajiks, as we'll see, speak a Persian language. Tajik and Persian are mutually intelligible, not perfectly, but mutually intelligible. But the critical thing is, those who expected the Tajiks to follow in the direction of Iranian Islam were completely fooling themselves, because the Tajiks, unlike the Iranians, are Sunni Muslims, not Shia, and therefore they had a defense against the Tajik version of fundamentalist Islam. So on the one hand, in the 3% of the population that is in the Gorno-Badakhshan, you have significant adherence, first and foremost, to fundamentalist Islam, but also to the Aga Khan, which represents yet another branch of this. It's not one that most people consider Islamic, but that's a bigger issue I won't get into. So you don't, it's not one big picture. Moreover, there's something else going on. The Soviet government, as all of you know, worked very hard to try to stamp out religion, including Islam in Central Asia. The number of mosques went from tens of thousands in pre-Soviet times to a handful by the 1980s. And the number of people who knew anything about, who knew much about Islam, who'd read the Quran, who'd actually ever seen a mullah or an imam, was quite small. So there was a break in the tradition of Islam in many places in Central Asia. In the 1990s, many people came back to Islam, but they came back to a simplified Islam that they'd gotten from a variety of missionaries, not just the Iranian and the Afghan, who attracted attention, but from Turkey. Turkey sent more Islamic missionaries into Central Asia than Iran did in the 1990s, something that's usually ignored. And the kind of Islam that Turkey was promoting was Sunni, but not fundamentalist. Unfortunately, as you also know, fundamentalists tend to come from people not who know a great deal about Islam, but by people who know very little about it. That's true in other religions as well. It's always easier, as I like to say, to move a piece of paper with a fan than to move a brick. People who have a firm grip on what Islam is are not likely to follow the fundamentalist calls, but people who only know they are Muslims. And that was a status that many people in Central Asia were reduced to by the Soviet anti-religious campaigns, were more likely to pick up. This has had, however, a very interesting development in the last 10 years that most people have ignored. Many people in Central Asia, especially in Kazakhstan, but elsewhere as well, are turning away from Islam because they're upset with the fact that Islam has become identified with certain values. And what you see is the spread of Protestant Christianity and other faiths, and also animist faiths. And this is true across the region, so that you see people who find a home in other faiths because they object to Islam. That's going on too. I would guess there'll be more of it, especially as the governments in the 5 capitals increasingly reflect the views of the overwhelming majority of the population, which defines itself as Islamic, even if the faith isn't very, very much present, to express that faith publicly will alienate some members of the intelligentsia and others in all 5 countries. And we will see not a more Islamic Central Asia, but a vastly more complex one that will include elements not only of Islam, but of Christianity, animism, and a variety of faiths. This is not something that we should oppose. Rather, we should try to make sure that as that development happens, we do not see someone try to repress others because they choose not to have the faith that people would like to have as the majority. I could say a great deal more about Islam. I think I will touch on it as I go through the issue of ethnicity, because ethnicity is related to Islam, but it's not the same thing. And it's not the same thing in any of the 5 countries or in this region as a whole. And that needs to be stressed. If one looked at the area that now is encompassed by these 5 countries before 1917, in the last decades of the Russian Empire, one would have seen a population that was almost entirely Muslim, that was Turkic and Persian, mostly Turkic, but also Persian in the case of Tajiks, that was multilingual. Most people in Central Asia, if they were nomadic, knew several languages because they traveled. It was not uncommon for someone who was a Kazakh to go as far as from Almaty to Aktobe or Aktirau several times a year. It was not uncommon for people in Kyrgyzstan to also move around. And so they learned lots of languages. They were bilingual and in some cases trilingual. When the basic divide in Central Asia before 1917, and the one that is the basis for much that's going on to this day, was not between Muslims and others, not between Turkic speakers and Persian speakers, but between people who were sedentaries and people who were nomads. Up until as early as the 4th and 5th centuries Common Era, the people who today are the Uzbeks and the Tajiks were sedentary populations. They were mostly agriculturalists and they were traders. But they did not move around a great deal. As a result, both Uzbek and Tajik identity have been more stable than the others. The north of that bound were two ethnic groups, the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, who were both nomads. And south of it were the Turkmens, who were also nomads. Historically, as you know, peoples who are longtime sedentaries tend to form larger collective identities, while those who are nomads tend to be restricted to families, tribes, or clans. Not surprisingly, when the Soviet government came in and created the proto-states, the Union Republics, which have become, since 1991, the 5 countries in this region, they followed first and foremost the principle of sedentaries versus nomads. And then they followed subdivisions within nomads because the Soviets understood something that unfortunately most people don't understand, because nomads represent such a small part of the population. They understood, and we have to understand, that there are 2 kinds of nomads, only 2, and I'll come back to that. When the Soviets came in with the policy known in Russian as razmejevание, the drawing of lines, they created first and foremost what is now Uzbekistan and what is now Tajikistan, areas that were based on sedentary populations. Initially, Uzbekistan did not have the Karakalpak Autonomous Republic in the far west, and we'll come back to that because that's a political football in Uzbekistan to this day. With respect to the 3 nomadic peoples, who were largely nomadic right up through the 19th century, the Soviets faced the task of dealing first with Turkmenistan and then with the two different kinds of nomadism north of the Uzbek-Tajik boundary. Turkmenistan was a tribal society and remains a tribal society. But because it's so closed off from the rest of the world, one tribe took control in Soviet times, and it's the very same tribe in Turkmenistan that controls Turkmenistan to this day. Turkmenistan is, with the possible exception of North Korea, the most closed off country in the world. We know, unfortunately, very little about it. That's beginning to change. The latest leadership succession in Turkmenistan is opening it up, but you still have an incredibly repressive society where the control of the country by a single clan defines how identity is constructed. All of the leaders since 1991 have been members of that clan, just as almost all of the leaders between 1917 and 1991 were members of this clan. The clan, as a articulator of a nomadic society, has defined what Turkmen identity and ethnicity mean. That's remained true, even though Turkmenistan now is an almost wholly sedentary population. There are a few people who move around, but very few. What we have is a situation of high tension between an urbanized population that is being run by a pre-modern nomadic clan. I would suspect that the time will come when that clash will lead to an explosion. Whether it will happen in 5 years or 10 years or next week is impossible to say, given how little we know inside. North of the Uzbek-Tajik pathway, which follows along the great trade routes of the Silk Road, about which you know, were two ethnic communities, the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz. As I said, there are only two kinds of nomadic peoples in the world, and the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz each represented one of them. There are nomads who go back and forth, covering long distances, and there are nomads who go up and down mountains and taking their flocks up the mountain in the spring and down the mountain in the fall. That may sound like just who could possibly care about that? Let me tell you what it means, why it's important. Nomadic communities like the Kazakh tend to develop national myths that tie together people into larger ethnic federations. In Kazakhstan, there are 3 such groups, which are creatively named the lesser, the greater, and the middle. Kazakh politics and Kazakh identity, since Soviet times and even before that, has been based on which of those communities you are a part of. If you look at the great events of Kazakh history in the last 50 years, take for either, say, the December 1986 riots, when Kazakhs supposedly revolted as a nationality against the Moscow's installation of an ethnic Russian as party leader, and you go a little deeper, what you see is what that fight was about was between one Jus tribal confederation and another tribal confederation, one of which was linked to the previous ruler of the country, and the other was linked to the people who were going to replace him. The same pattern holds as late as January of last year, when you had the riots in the Kazakh cities, and then the intervention of Russian-led forces. Again, the Western coverage wanted to reduce this to all Kazakhs against all outsiders. In fact, Kazakh society was deeply divided along these use lines. I've met hundreds of Kazakhs over the years, and I will tell you that every single one of them, every single one I've met, can tell you instantly what Jus he is a member of. It's simply part of their national identity. That doesn't mean they don't feel close to other tribal confederations, but that subdivision keeps Kazakhstan from becoming a unitary totalitarian state the way Turkmenistan has become. And it also has important regional dimensions because the three Jus are not concentrated all in the same place. The Middle Jus, for example, is in Western Kazakhstan and has been, shall we say, more given to revolt against the center than the other two. But again, the idea of Kazakh identity as having taken final shape is almost certainly wrong. Again, as in Turkmenistan, nomadism has almost been destroyed. There's almost none of it. The Soviets undertook to destroy the nomadic way of life at the end of the 1920s and the 1930s as part of the collectivization campaign, because the Soviets understood very well that controlling people who are nomads is very, very difficult because they can always move. So you wanted to destroy that. But the identity that's based on that nomadic tradition has not been destroyed, but remains. And it's why Kazakhstan has been a more open society than others. I'm going to come back to what most people explain Kazakh identity and the Kazakh ethnic problem in a minute. With respect to the Kyrgyz, the situation is fundamentally different. If every Kazakh can tell you which Jus he or she is a member of, every Kyrgyz can tell you his 7 direct male ancestors. Everyone knows their family membership, and they can spew them out. It's quite amusing when you go to an international meeting where there are Kyrgyz present. 2 Kyrgyz will meet, and suddenly you hear first from one and then from the other 7 names. In almost every case, when you go back 7 generations, there's a commonality. But what that has meant is that Kyrgyz national identity has been far less strong than in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and it's far less strong even than in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, because people identify with families rather than with tribal confederations, and they are much more given to recombine with other families. And that lack of a common national identity, strong common national identity, has made it very difficult for Kyrgyzstan to remain stable. It's opened the way for efforts to promote democracy there, greater efforts, in fact, than have been true in any of the other republics. But it has also meant that those efforts have been undermined by a population that doesn't fit comfortably in it. So having given you that sort of overview of ethnicity in the region as a whole, let me shift now first to focusing on what commonalities that makes for all 5 countries, and then look at the 5 countries individually briefly, because that's where the ethnicity really is critical. The usual myth, and it is primarily a myth, is that the Soviets created borders to create tensions. In other words, if you want people to hate each other, the best way to do it is to take something from one and give it to the other. And it is certainly true that in the course of constructing the Soviet republics, Moscow drew borders which are not defensible in ethnic grounds, but which do reflect a desire to divide and rule. One of the biggest problems in Central Asia in the last 30 years has been the inability of most of these countries to agree on their borders. Why is that? Well, because historically, people who were Kyrgyz lived in what's part now Kazakhstan or in Uzbekistan, and so on and so forth. There have been fights, some of the worst, between the Kyrgyz and the Uzbeks, and the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks, almost going to war in the case of the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks over the borders. And it is true that some of those borders are simply divided, the remnants or the survivals of the divide and rule policy of the Soviet central government. That is being solved, but very, very slowly. It is also true that the ethnicity that a lot of people expect somehow was going to supersede all of this, hasn't. There were many, many people, heavily in Turkey, who expected the Turks of Central Asia to form a single Turkic republic, a single Turkestan, as it was called before 1917, and they expected that to happen again. They expected, excuse me, the Soviet borders to dissolve and a new country to emerge, Turkestan. There are people in all four Turkic republics. The Tajiks are not part of this, but all four Turkic republics who think that way and whose primary identity is probably Turkic, not Kazakh or Kyrgyz or Turkmen. But those numbers are likely dwindling as these states are simply around for longer and longer. After 30 years, most people in this region identify according to one of the five. So now let me talk about each of the five, starting with Kazakhstan. Those of you who have read about Central Asia know that in Soviet times, and unfortunately largely since Soviet times in the West, typically refer to this region as Central Asia and Kazakhstan. Why don't they call it Central Asia? There's a good reason. Because Kazakhstan was created in a fundamentally different way. If the republics if the four other republics were there was no Russian population to include within them as a way of holding them in the case of Kazakhstan, which has the largest land border in the world with Russia here, what you had was the possibility of including a large number of ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan, which would have the effect of meaning that Kazakhstan had to worry about the possibility that if it ever cozied up completely with the other Central Asian republics, it would be at risk of losing the northern third of the country. Up until 1986, which is not that so long ago, the ethnic Russians who were included in that formed a plurality in Kazakhstan. That the fact that they did in the northern cities that you can see on the map in front of you means, in fact, to this day, that many Russians still think that Kazakhstan is so fundamentally different than the rest that it can be kept in line by being threatened with dismemberment. Putin has said some things in this regard, and so have other Russian officials. There is a fundamental reason why that isn't true. At present, not only are the ethnic Russians not a plurality, they are an increasingly small national minority. The Kazakhs form 80% of the population and are on their way by 2035 or 2040 to being 95% of the population. The ethnic Russians in the north are leaving. They are dying out. They're a much older population. They're not having children, being an older population. And the Kazakhs are behaving demographically the way other Central Asians are, having many children and being much younger. What that means is that the binational society that many people expected and others insisted Astana and before that Almaty pursue is no longer a real option, because Kazakhstan is becoming a Central Asian country with a vast majority of its population being members of the titular nationality. And I want to address one thing here, which is relevant elsewhere, but which I want to hit on here in particular. Most urban Kazakhs, and that's most Kazakhs now, speak Russian as their primary language. That has allowed Vladimir Putin and some others to retain their belief that the Kazakhs who speak Russian are in somehow part of the Russian world. You should know, and I'm sure you do, that language and ethnic identity are not the same thing. It is often the case that colonized peoples accept the language of the colonizer as a way upward and as a way out and as a social lift, if you will, without changing their ethnic identity at all. And it's often true that it's precisely those people in colonies who have who have learned and used the language of the empire that are the most nationalist, not the least, and are the most committed to independence. The Irish did not revolt against the British Empire there until people stopped speaking Gaelic and began speaking English, the language of the empire. And it is certainly true that India's drive for independence against Britain was led by English-speaking Indians, including the most prominent members of the Congress Party. Now, that's that's a halfway course. And in fact, it's my view that the people of India have a particularly good reason to understand what's going on in Kazakhstan. First, you will see lots of people, and you do now, who speak Russian, but think of themselves as Kazakhs. And then you will see a drive coming from below to shift back away from a language other than the language which is identified as the imperial language. And that's what you see in Kazakhstan, where an increasing number of people are demanding that Kazakh be used by everyone. That is not, repeat, not Kazakhstan government policy. That is what a lot of people are saying from below. Russian propaganda outlets like to insist that Kazakhstan is on its way to becoming like Ukraine. In other words, it's oppressing Russians and so forth. The fact is, at present, the Kazakhs are such an overwhelming majority, 80%, with the Russians being 15%, perhaps at best, that it's utterly reasonable that Kazakh be the dominant language, and that Kazakhstan will not be a binational state as many hoped or expected. That's a very different situation than we have. In fact, and again, I would need hours and hours to talk about all of this. The most important ethnic problems in Kazakhstan are not with ethnic Russians, despite the coverage Moscow gives to them, but with small ethnic communities of two kinds. The first are Kazakhs returning from abroad where they fled because of collectivization, the various wars, and so on. These are known in Kazakh as the Oromanya. They are people who grew up in China. They're people who grew up in Turkey. They're people who grew up even in the United States, who've come back and who have a very different vision of what being a Kazakh means, because their Kazakhhness has been formed in a different cultural tradition. There have been serious clashes with these people, and there's a great deal of worry about what are these people about, and it gets in the way of relations with China and a variety of other things. The second kind of ethnic clash, or ethnic groups that are engaged in a clash with the dominant ethnic Kazakhs, are numerically small nationalities like the Dungan, people who are also have their primary homelands in Xinjiang, Western China, and who have a very different way of life. My own sense, and this is because I am someone who believes that, well, demography is not destiny except in the very long term, that the increasing percentage of ethnic Kazakhs in the population is going to reduce the Russians and these other groups to being very much small minorities who will not play the role that even they do now, and that trend has been obscured by a Russian media that chooses instead to focus on those clashes as if the Russians were still 37% of the population and the Kazakhs only 35, as was the case in 1986. That is an enormous demographic change in a very short period of time. I'm old enough and I've been in the business long enough that I remember the day. I remember the day right to now when one of the very best analysts of Central Asia reported that the Kazakhs, for the first time ever, outnumbered the ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan. But if you read much of the stuff that's written about Kazakhstan to this day, you would not know that that has in fact happened. There is the sense that Kazakhstan is still the outlier in Central Asia. One of the reasons that Russia wanted to keep Kazakhstan as the outlier was because the view was that the Uzbeks, who are so much larger than all the other nationalities, would never be able to form a Central Asian union of any kind, because the Kyrgyz, the Turkmens, and the Tajiks would all feel too threatened. Only if the Kazakhs played a role as a Central Asian country or republic was there a possibility that you could form some kind of broader Central Asian identity. My own view, and this is looking into the future, probably another 20 to 30 years, is that with the change in Kazakhstan we're seeing, it becomes thinkable that you could have a Central Asian union. There is even conversation at present about having tariff unions within this region. That's a big change in what kind of in what's possible. And I would urge you to keep in mind that possibility in the future. Kyrgyzstan, as I've mentioned before, because identity is so closely tied to families rather than larger, more extended groups, has been the most unstable of the Central Asian countries in terms of identity and in terms of political arrangements. But it has also been the one most willing to keep coming back to the issue of possible real democracy and of being open to the world. Whether that's sustainable, I don't know, but it's happening. Tajikistan, the third, the most important ethnic problem in Tajikistan is not Tajik national identity, but the question of what that country is going to be able to do with the Pamir nationalities in the Gorno-Badakhshan. A third of the territory of the republic, but only about 3% of its population. Unfortunately, they are right on the border with Afghanistan. They are a major entry point, not only for drugs coming from the south, but also for fundamentalist Islamist ideas. And they have been in near open revolt against Dushanbe since the end of Soviet times. In recent months, there's been some progress in suppressing that, but whether that's going to be successful remains to be seen. It is very, very difficult to control people who live in mountain fastness. And so I would expect that Tajikistan is going, like Kyrgyzstan, is going to be a troubled nation and a troubled national identity. Not so much like the Kyrgyz because of family divisions or clanic divisions as in Kazakhstan, both of which have been mostly wiped out among the Tajiks who've been sedentaries since the 4th and 5th centuries, Common Era. But because there is this group within that country that no one seems to really have figured out how they could be integrated. And finally are the Uzbeks in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is the largest country in the region. It is certainly the most powerful. It is also, if you ignore, and we'll talk about Karakalpakia, if you ignore Karakalpakstan in the west, it is probably the most ethnically homogeneous and ethnically united. There is broad agreement among Uzbeks of who an Uzbek is. And again, it is an identity that goes back more than a millennium to a sedentary population that's been sedentary again since the 4th and 5th centuries Common Era. And so if Uzbekistan did not have the Karakalpak Republic in the west, south of the Aral Sea, we would be talking about the emergence of a real nation state in the sense we understand in the West. The big problem, however, is Uzbekistan has a colonial possession of its own, Karakalpakstan, one of the poorest and most demographically challenged places on earth. Worse, Karakalpaks consider themselves to be vastly closer to the Kazakhs than they do to the Uzbeks. And some of them would like independence. Others would like to be transferred back to Kazakhstan. But what they don't want is to be ruled by Tashkent or be Uzbekified. This has led to violence. We've just seen the completion of massive trials of people who were involved in protest the last summer, with very heavy sentences cast out. This is an area that is a constant breeding ground of problems, not only because the language is different, it's closer to Kazakh than it is to Uzbek, not only because these people are suffering, the Aral Sea, which this is another one of my favorite examples of how people live with an image that's 50 years out of date. There is no Aral Sea today. The Aral Sea has dried up. That is a huge problem. But we still show on even pretty good maps as if the Aral Sea still was there. We need to wipe that out. That's a problem with almost every map you're going to see. And the death of the Aral Sea is an issue that everyone in the world should be concerned about, because the minerals on the bottom of that sea are now being spread by the winds into the population. And Karakalpakstan has one of the highest rates of cancer in the world, precisely because the Aral Sea has dropped off. That's something that those who want to help the Central Asians need to focus on. Now, I want to conclude by very briefly talking about how outsiders view this mix that we've been talking about of religious and ethnic identities and what they think they can do about it. Moscow, for the Russian Federation, has, as I've said, continued to believe that it's still Central Asia and Kazakhstan. There's still a sense that Kazakhs can be handled because of the ethnic Russian minority. With respect, they are wrong. Kazakhstan is not a binational republic anymore, and Russia's talk, as if it were, is something that simply has to be dismissed. The danger is that Moscow might act on its false belief and get itself into even more difficulty than it has faced in the case of Ukraine. China obviously has a huge interest in this region as a transportation zone. It's the major one road, one path approach that China has articulated for linking China to Europe. Goes right through Central Asia, much of it anyway, and it wants stability and it wants control. The trouble is the Chinese have behaved in Central Asia abysmally. They have been more arrogant than you can believe. Many of them have insisted, many Chinese officials have demanded and in some places gotten extraterritorial status so they aren't judged by local courts. And there is a rising tide of anti-Chinese sentiment across this world, especially in Kyrgyzstan, to a lesser extent in Kazakhstan and elsewhere. But that's a huge problem. China thinks when China was behaving only in terms of economic expansion, this wasn't too bad. And basically, China had deferred to the Russian Federation for the security dimension. But with the weakening of Russian power, the Chinese have been using private military companies to do rather more in the security area, especially in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. The Chinese have, in fact, already 2 military facilities in Tajikistan and 1 in Kyrgyzstan. And this has produced, as you would expect, an upsurge of anti-Chinese sentiment. With respect to the two other outside players, Turkey and the West, Turkey expected that all Turkic peoples would line up behind it. And in the 1990s, there was a great deal of sentiment in the four Turkic countries of Central Asia to do just that. But that has been, that expectation has been watered down considerably. There's still going to be talk, but the idea of some kind of pan-Turkic or pan-Turanian union of the kind that some, Yusuf Akçura and others had talked about a century ago, in my opinion, doesn't seem to be going very well. The tragedy of Western countries, the Europeans and the Americans, is that they've continued to view Central Asia not in terms of itself, but in terms of being a chessboard on which a game is being played vis-a-vis Russia or vis-a-vis China. What I hope my talk today has inspired you to believe, convinced you to believe, or reinforced you to believe, is that the five countries of Central Asia are important countries in their own right, with their own identities, with their own set of beliefs, their own set of hopes, and that those have to be taken seriously in the first instance if we're going to work with them effectively, rather than seeing them only as pawns on somebody else's chessboard. They're a lot more than that, and they deserve to be recognized as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goble, for your interpretive address on this very interesting topic. Your remarks were both enlightening and thought-provoking. You were able to convey the depth and complexity of the topic clearly and with great eloquence. Ethnicity and religion in Central Asia, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, is a complex and interrelated issue. There are many different forms of ethnic groups in Central Asia, and most of them have distinct religion and culture. This is a complex topic, and it has always been a cause of great debate and conflict in Central Asia. However, in recent years, there has been much progress towards resolving these conflicts through dialogue and cooperation among the various ethnic groups in the region. I believe that this is a step in the right direction, and it is very important for Central Asia to continue working towards this goal. As you mentioned, history has often played a role in the development of conflicts between ethnic groups and religious communities. Islam has a significant presence in the region and has a significant impact on the society and culture of the people. As time passes, more and more people have been coming to the region, and the different customs and traditions are being brought into the region with them. The five stands in the region have been different and also diverse over the centuries due to their difference in culture and religion. The countries in the region have been divided into several ethnic and religious groups and have been witnessing conflicts over the years. This is one of the reasons why it is important for the Central Asian states to continue to work together towards a peaceful and prosperous future for the region. In order to maintain peace and harmony within the region, it is important that the governments of the various Central Asian countries work together to promote understanding and tolerance among the various ethnic groups within their borders. It is also very important for the government of the Central Asian countries to make sure that there are equal opportunities for all members of the various ethnic groups to participate in political and economic decision-making within their country. In recent years, however, the government of the five stands have made great efforts to promote peace and cooperation among their different ethnic groups and religious communities. All of this would go a long way toward achieving peace and prosperity in the region. I commend your thoughts and observations on this very important topic and look forward to hearing more from you in our next Q&A segment. Thank you once again. Now let's take some questions. I would request our attendees to write down their questions in the chat box, and I will be reading them out to our speaker for discussion. Thank you. So I have a question. How do different ethnic and religious groups in Central Asia perceive and interact with each other, and what factors shape their attitude and behavior toward each other?
Well, in each of the countries, each of the five countries, you have various strains of Islam, mostly in the Sunni tradition. There are some Shia, but mostly in the Sunni tradition. And the question is, how tightly held are these? There are some people who are usually called ethnic Muslims. That is, people who say they're Muslim, but the content, there's not much content to that. To others who are more committed, and to some who are politicized. The number who are politicized Muslims, that is, who see Islam as the basis of political action, is relatively small. It's probably greatest in Tajikistan, but it is not that great in places, especially like Kazakhstan. The question of Turkmenistan is open, and Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan are somewhere in the middle. Relations among these various communities are sometimes tense, sometimes not. They are often about issues that are apparently only tangential related to religious ideas, but rather to more practical issues like control of property or defining a law that the state may or may not adopt. But there's no, the one thing I would insist on is that in none of these countries is there a single Islamic position that's against someone else, nor is this the divisions that exist within the Islamic community. Those are not stable. They change over time, they're evolving. I think one of the reasons why Islamism did not succeed in Central Asia, or hasn't yet, is that most people grew up in a secular environment and still value secularism. Many people who are Muslims, self-identified Muslims, still believe that a secular arrangement of society, albeit one informed by Islamic values in some issues, is a better way to arrange things than having an Islamic state. They have lots of examples, or two classic examples, Afghanistan under the Taliban and Iran, as to what an Islamic state may lead to. And overwhelmingly in Central Asia, there's no interest in following that path.
Thank you so much, Mr. Goble. Next question is, what are the reasons that radical ideologies did not gain traction in Central Asia?
I think there are several. Let me try to give you a list. First, I think many people, the Islamists could play to social tensions, but the governments in the region have done a pretty good job in responding to that. And the Islamists have been undercut by their own actions and the actions of the governments they come from. Many Central Asians have been put off by Islamism because of what they see happening in Iran and Afghanistan, and they're not willing to go that way. Second thing I think is, and this is something that's generally ignored, it was Turkish Islam and Turkish Islamic missionaries that played the largest role in the recovery of Islamist positions in Central Asia. This was a more moderate Sunni Islam than the Iranian Shia missionaries, which were far less numerous, but got far much more play. Third, I think the Central Asian countries, being poor, being new, knew they were going to have to get help. They knew very well that if they turned to Islamism, Western countries would be less willing to provide it, and that Russia would be more willing to exploit that to demand a military, or more generally security presence in them, and that they mostly didn't want. So I think it was a combination of those factors and their own history of wanting their religion to be theirs, not something coming in from the outside.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Next question is Kazakhstan dependent on immigrants and asylum seekers from the Middle East and other regions?
No, not yet. The Kazakhstan is still in a position that it can provide, or that its demographic development allows for it to produce, to fill the jobs that it has. It has absorbed a certain number of immigrants from the Russian Federation and from other Central Asian countries, but the numbers relative to the total workforce are still small. So that's not a major issue right now.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Next question is, how do gender, class, and other intersecting identities intersect with ethnicity and religion to shape experiences of discrimination and marginalization in Central Asia?
It is a tragic fact of life that in many Islamic cultures, but far from all, there is a patriarchal approach that ends up by supporting gender discrimination. And the good news in Central Asia is that a large number of Central Asian Muslims remain affected by the modernist understanding of Islam that was originally promoted there by missionaries from Tatarstan. I can't avoid saying, stressing just how important that was. One of the great tragedies, and one of the things that's led to more patriarchal discrimination against women in Central Asia, is that what the Soviets did, they were afraid of the Tatars having an influence in modernizing Islam in Central Asia. So they imprisoned or killed most of the Tatar missionaries, leaving in place a much more deeply conservative, anti-woman group of ideologists. Some of that continues. It's become, I think, less true in Kazakhstan. The track record on gender equality in Central Asia is not good, but it's not as bad as it is sometimes portrayed. There are true horror stories, and I don't want to whitewash it, but to think we are on the verge of anything like what led to the protests in Iran over the last year, I think exaggerates the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Next question is, as Central Asia opens up, how would these diverse nations engage with other countries beyond the region? Also, what approaches are other nations using to formulate their policies towards the countries in Central Asia?
Central Asia has worked very, very hard, I mean, to reach out to the rest of the world. It's quite striking how many embassies and how many cultural missions and how many educational opportunities Central Asians have sought abroad. They very much want to cooperate. Multi-vector foreign policy has become something of a curse word in lots of circles. But the fact is, the countries of Central Asia know that if they're going to be able to maintain their position, they need as many and as diverse allies as they can possibly find. And so they've been working very hard. That effort, I think, has paid dividends. The Central Asian countries get more attention now than they used to, largely because of the efforts of the Central Asians themselves. At the same time, as I said at the beginning of my talk, there is still a tendency, unfortunately, in many countries around the world, to have a vision of the stands as if they were uniformly a Turkic, Muslim, backward, poor region. That's simply not true. And there could be a great deal more interaction and cooperation if the West in particular, and Russia too, were to overcome some of that Orientalist nonsense. But we're working on it, but it's not been achieved yet.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Next question is it possible that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, competing for resources or leadership in their region, could face conflicts with each other?
Well, any two neighboring countries are at risk at some point of going into conflict. The biggest conflict in Central Asia, which I haven't even mentioned today because it's at the margin of what I was asked to talk about, is water. There are two countries in the region that are water surplus, and there are three that are water short, increasingly water short. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have more water still, despite the global warming, than they can use, and they decide how much water can flow to the downstream countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, all three of whom are suffering from serious water shortages. The death of the RLC that we mentioned didn't just happen. It was the result of rapid population growth, the wrong kind of agricultural development, massive urbanization. And that meant that the sea died because there wasn't enough water going in to compensate for the evaporation caused by the sun. There are very real bases for conflicts among these countries, not just on the narrow issues of border delimitation, but on access to water. The important thing here to note is that Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are on the same side of that divide. They're both water short societies. Now, could two water short societies go to war with each other? I suppose it's possible, but it's less likely than the kind of conflicts you might see between the water surplus countries and the water short countries. A war between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan would do nothing to solve the problem that each has of not having enough water. One can more easily imagine a military drive by Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan into Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan in the hopes of capturing more water. I hope that won't happen. I hope that as Kazakhstan acts increasingly as a Central Asian country, serves as a balance to the overwhelming power of the Uzbeks and allows for greater cooperation because the Turkmens, Tajiks, and Kyrgyz can cooperate with the Kazakhs as a balance to Uzbek cultural power, if you will, that the five countries will be able to work out on their own without an outside arbiter how much water goes to each so that all will be able to develop and conflicts will be less likely.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Next question is, in an era of increasing bipolarization in global geopolitics, how significant are the Central Asian countries on the global stage?
Well, the world is a complicated place and getting more so. We have, the new bipolarity with whom? I mean, the West versus China, the West versus Russia, the West versus Russia and China, China versus Russia. I mean, the issue is more complicated than that. Central Asia is always going to have to look over its shoulder at China and Russia because of where it is. An old friend of mine who became president of Estonia once famously said that he would rather have Canada as a neighbor. But Estonia doesn't have Canada as a neighbor, and that means it isn't going to be able to look that way. What I was arguing for in my talk is that while of course it's going to be true that the countries of Central Asia are going to look to Russia and China perhaps more than some in Europe or the United States would like, that has to be understood by virtue of their geography. The only way you could overcome that would be a massive Western investment of money and security resources, which I see very little prospect of. So what I would guess is that the Central Asians will continue to move in the direction they've been moving in for the last 3 decades. They will be pursuing closer ties with a variety of actors, including the Europeans and the Americans, but they're not going to break with either China or Russia, because to do so would undermine themselves in fundamental ways.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Next question is, could Central Asia have been more prosperous if it had remained a part of the USSR, given that the region remains relatively isolated even in the 21st century?
That question presupposes that it was relatively prosperous as part of the Soviet Union. The fact is that Central Asia was a very poor area in Soviet times. It was a cotton monoculture economy. Cotton monoculture was introduced by Moscow to force the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Kyrgyz, and the Turkmens to have to depend on someone else to provide them with food. The ability of these countries to feed themselves was called into question. Now, two thoughts. First, what makes people want to be independent isn't necessarily economic gain. Second, I mean, very often when countries strive for independence, they suffer a decline in their standard of living because of the disruption of trade routes and so forth. At the same time, I would argue that the Central Asian countries have more capacity today to better their own people than was true before 1991, because they can sell and keep the profits of the resources and their industrial produce, which in the past they would have had to transfer sizably to Moscow. So yes, there are terrible transportation problems, and there aren't enough railroads, there aren't enough highways. Air travel is still rudimentary in many ways. Are things changing for the better? Yes. Are railroads being built? Yes. Now we have negotiations about cross-Caspian trade. We have negotiations about things being sent east through China. So I find it difficult to imagine that any of these countries, as many difficulties as they have, would have been better off if the Soviet Union had continued to exist. At least the Soviet Union that behaved the way it had traditionally done. If you'd had something like what Gorbachev talked about in his New Union Treaty, with a radical devolution of authority, with it keeping a common chapeau over everyone, that might be different. But that's not the Soviet Union that one would be going back to. That's about creating a society which Gorbachev talked about, but which was never in fact realized.
Thank you, Mr. Goble, for your analytical response. Next question is, to what extent does regionalism and a sense of shared regional identity impact Kazakhstan's relations with other nations in Central Asia?
Kazakhstan is increasingly seeing itself as a Central Asian country, precisely because its population is now so overwhelmingly Kazakh. It's no longer a binational society. That's the point I was trying to make. And so I think that we're going to see Kazakhstan become a vastly more active player in Central Asian politics, geopolitics, and that sets the stage for occasions when Astana and Tashkent are not going to be on the same side. But it also opens the way for broader regional cooperation because it provides a counterweight to Uzbek dominance, which the other three countries are not interested in living under.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Next question. So how have recent political and social changes such as democratization, globalization, and the rise of social media affected ethnic and religious dynamics in the Central Asia?
Well, obviously, as societies open up and more information gets communicated, more things are possible and exposed. The biggest change, I think, is that with the internet and with the social media, people know about more things than they did. And that may strengthen some things, but it may also have the effect of leading people to focus on those groups that are most effective at using those media, not necessarily focusing on indicators as to how much influence they have. A presence online is important. A presence online is not the only or even the best measure of how much influence any particular idea has.
Thank you so much, Mr. Goble. Next question is, how have external actors such as neighboring countries or international organizations influenced the shaping of ethnic and religious dynamics in Central Asia?
I think the international community has been quite good in calling for ethnic peace in the region. I think it's been very, very wrong in continuing to see Russia or see Kazakhstan as a binational state where the ethnic Russian minority is the only player other than the Kazakhs. I think that's simply a misreading of the facts on the ground. I think mostly the international community has said the right things. Has it always implemented them well? No, partially because it hasn't had the kind of expertise on the ground, people who know the language, people who understand the local culture, who are then in a position to help the local population craft the kind of society I think we'd all like to see emerge.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Next question is, what are the sectors that Central Asia is prioritizing in order to achieve economic stabilization?
Well, the first and most important is to develop trade routes out, to be able to sell its products, its natural resources abroad, and then to make sure that the profits from those sales go back into the population. That requires a significant government presence, the use of tax and other policy, other levers in order to make sure that the money actually gets invested. In those countries where the governments have worked to get people to reinvest in their own society have seen real progress. Those that have allowed the export of capital face serious problems. Central Asia is closer to the positive end of that extent than the negative, but could more be done? Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Next question. Is there any involvement or influence by the Middle East or OIC in the Central Asian region?
I don't think the Middle East has as much influence over Central Asia as people think. I think the Central Asians see themselves as Central Asians rather than a branch office of the Middle East. I don't think it's part of the greater Middle East in the understanding of Central Asians. It is part of the greater Middle East, however, in the understanding of some Western countries. And it's also possible that it's part of a greater Middle East in the understanding of some in Moscow. But I think the Central Asians see themselves as Central Asians, and that thinking of them as part of the Middle East is to put a spin on what's going on there that's not justified.
Thank you so much, Mr. Goble. Next question. To what extent do Central Asian governments use ethnic and religious identity as a tool to maintain power and control over the populations?
Everybody uses it. That it's a question of how. Promoting national identity is a way of promoting support for the current government, and current governments have an interest in that. So it's not surprising that that happens. The question is, how far do you go, and do you use it to justify repressive policies or not? Are the Central Asians doing some of it? Yes. Are they doing so much to become repressive? I think in Turkmenistan, you could argue that it's being used repressively. I don't think that there's a strong case for that in the other four.
Thank you so much, Mr. Goble. Next question. How have ethnic and religious identities in Central Asia evolved over time, and what factors have contributed to their development?
Well, that's what I tried to talk about in my presentation. You've seen a set of different political situations. You've seen different outside influences. You've seen different political arrangements that open different possibilities. You've seen, excuse me, different economic arrangements. You've seen the different experiences of different generations. Obviously, someone born in 1991 is different than someone born in 1951. The person born in 1951 came of age when the Soviet Union still existed. The person born in 91 is born when the Soviet Union no longer exists. that's got to have enormous consequences and does. So all the things that we could list that have an impact on changing identity are true in Central Asia as well as anywhere else. My own what I've tried my own view, which I hope informed what I said today, is that Central Asia needs to be understood not as something radically different from anywhere else. It's affected by exactly the same factors other places are, and it should not be put in a box and treated as some kind of exotic, strange flower that can only be understood if we forget everything we know about other societies. That's a mistake, and it's a mistake which tragically is all too common.
Absolutely, Mr. Goble. I totally agree with you. Thank you so much. Next question. How do Central Asian societies reconcile the tensions between traditional cultural practices and modern religious beliefs and practices?
Well, first off, there are some people who don't see that as that there being a clash. Others do. And they see it in different areas and different clashes, and they are solved in different ways. In some places where the powers that be ally themselves only with modern ones or only with the traditional, you may see repression. In other places, you may see a working out. One of the things that's interesting to me is that in Kyrgyzstan, there are places where you have a traditionalist Islamic leader and a modernist Islamic leader sharing the same mosque.
Yeah.
which is not the image you have if you think of this clash as somehow irreconcilable.
Thank you so much, Mr. Goble, for being here today with us. We had a successful discussion on today's theme, ethnicity and religion in Central Asia. I found your perspectives on this topic highly interesting and informative. I think you've offered important insights into the way people from different cultures and religions perceive and interact with each other. Thank you so much for that. You also gave us some great insight into the implications of such diversity on people's way of life and the way they operate in their communities. You also talked about the value of openness and tolerance and how these values can help advance people's understanding of one another. It is a great thing to see the understanding between people from different backgrounds living together in peace and harmony. I really enjoyed that aspect of your speech as well. Thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to seeing you again soon. I would
Thank you
like to
very
thank
much.
everyone. Thank you so much. I would like to thank everyone for attending today's special talk on the theme of ethnicity and religion in Central Asia as a part of the Exploring Central Asia talk series. I hope you all had a fruitful experience